destiny. I will never say never.
At the same time, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do any of the things I've been able to do, travel the world. I mean, I didn't have any money, you know, so.
There's a strange assumption people make about fame, that once you reach it early, you somehow grow into it naturally. That success teaches you how to carry it. That attention builds strength instead of strain. But that's rarely how it works. Sometimes fame arrives before identity has settled, before boundaries exist, before there's any real understanding of where the pressure should go. And when that happens, growth doesn't stop. It just happens under a microscope. For a long time, that microscope followed Justin Bieber everywhere. What the public saw was success at a scale most people never experience. Records broken, crowds screaming. A global presence before adulthood had even fully arrived. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it was pressure stacking faster than it could be processed. This isn't a story about one mistake or one headline moment. It's about accumulation, about what happens when expectations multiply while emotional tools are still forming, when discipline is demanded before stability exists, when millions project meaning onto someone who hasn't yet figured out who they are. Early signs were visible, but often reframed. Recklessness was excused as youth. Exhaustion was called attitude. Silence was interpreted as arrogance. Every reaction was judged, but very few pauses were allowed. That's the part people miss. Collapse doesn't usually begin with chaos. It begins with the absence of space. No room to recalibrate. No permission to slow down. No way to separate the person from the persona being consumed at scale. This story lives in that gap, between talent and toll, between success and survival. And once you start looking at it that way, the collapse stops feeling sudden and starts feeling tragically predictable. Before the pressure became visible, the structure was already fragile. That's the part most people overlook. When someone becomes famous as a child, the usual sequence of growth gets rearranged. Identity, discipline, boundaries, and self-regulation are supposed to develop before responsibility scales up. In this case, responsibility arrived first, fully formed, and everything else was forced to catch up. Justin Bieber didn't grow into fame. Fame grew around him. At an age when most people are still learning how to be anonymous, he was learning how to be watched. Every move mattered. Every reaction was recorded. Mistakes weren't moments. They were headlines. And because the success was real and overwhelming, there was very little incentive to slow anything down. From the outside, it looked like opportunity. From the inside, it was acceleration without insulation. What made this especially complicated was how quickly adulthood was expected of him. Not earned gradually, but assumed. He was expected to behave professionally, manage pressure, and regulate emotion at a level most adults struggle with, all while his personal identity was still forming. That mismatch creates tension long before it creates scandal. Early on, there were signs of exhaustion, not dramatic ones, subtle ones. Irritation in interviews, withdrawal, moments of visible frustration. But those signs were often reframed as entitlement or immaturity. The conversation rarely asked whether the system itself was sustainable. In environments like this, support often becomes conditional. People stay close as long as performance continues. Guidance turns into management. Care becomes logistics. The focus shifts from the person to the output, because output is measurable and rewarded. Another overlooked factor is how isolation develops inside constant attention. Fame doesn't eliminate loneliness. It intensifies it. Genuine connection becomes harder when everyone around you is tied to your success. Trust narrows, expression gets filtered, vulnerability becomes risky. When that happens, coping strategies don't disappear, they just move underground. As pressure increased, structure did not increase with it. There were schedules, teams, and expectations, but very little space for recalibration. Rest was temporary, reflection was delayed. Emotion was something to push through rather than process. This is how instability begins, not with rebellion, but with fatigue. Over time, fatigue changes behavior, reactions shorten, patience thins, impulses surface. But instead of slowing down to address those changes, the system often speeds up to outrun them. Tours continue. Appearances stack. Visibility remains constant. At this stage, accountability becomes abstract. Feedback arrives loudly but inconsistently. Praise and criticism coexist without clarity. It becomes difficult to know which signals matter. Noise replaces guidance. This is where confusion settles in. Not confusion about success, but about self. When your identity has been built around public reaction, it's hard to locate who you are without it. Silence feels threatening. Stillness feels like loss. For someone so young, that can be destabilizing. Public incidents eventually began to surface, behavior that could no longer be framed as youthful missteps or stress reactions. The narrative shifted quickly, as it often does. Admiration gave way to judgment. Curiosity turned into criticism. But what's important here is timing. These moments did not appear suddenly. They were the visible result of long-term accumulation. Years of pressure without pause. Years of expectation without proportional support. The public often sees these moments as turning points. In reality, they're exposure points. The moment when internal strain finally becomes external enough to be undeniable. Another element that complicates this phase is shame. Once behavior is publicly condemned, shame enters the system. Shame narrows options. It encourages defensiveness or withdrawal rather than reflection. And when shame is experienced publicly, it multiplies. This is when collapse begins to feel personal rather than structural. The individual becomes the problem rather than the environment that shaped the conditions. That shift is convenient, but incomplete, because systems that accelerate children into adult-level visibility without adult-level protection tend to produce the same outcomes again and again, different names, similar arcs. At this point, trust erodes. Not just public trust, but self-trust. Decision-making becomes reactive. Boundaries blur further. The person starts oscillating between resistance and remorse, neither of which creates stability. What's tragic is that many of these outcomes were preventable, not by removing success, but by pacing it, by allowing room for identity to develop without constant evaluation, by normalizing pause instead of punishing it. Instead, the system demanded resilience without teaching it. By the time concern became widespread, the damage was already layered. Emotional exhaustion, public scrutiny, internal confusion, all feeding into one another. Recovery at that point was no longer about fixing behavior. It was about rebuilding foundation. And rebuilding foundation takes time. Time that fame rarely allows willingly. This phase of the story is uncomfortable because it resists simple explanations. It's not just about bad choices. It's about too many choices made under too much pressure, too early, without enough space to understand their weight. Understanding this matters because without it, collapse gets framed as personal failure rather than predictable consequence. And when that happens, the cycle continues, ready to repeat with the next young name pushed into the same spotlight. This is not the end of the story, but it is the point where survival starts to matter more than success. And that distinction changes everything that follows. As the pressure intensified, the cracks became harder to ignore, but still easy to misinterpret. What the public often labeled as rebellion or arrogance was in many ways a loss of internal regulation. When structure fails internally, behavior becomes the language of distress. This is where the narrative usually simplifies, and simplification is dangerous. From the outside, it looked like someone rejecting responsibility. From the inside, it often feels like someone drowning in it. Expectations had not eased with age, they had multiplied. The margin for error narrowed, even as emotional fatigue deepened. Every mistake carried symbolic weight, as if it confirmed a story people were already ready to tell. What made this phase especially volatile was the absence of safe interruption. Fame creates a paradox. The more visible you are, the fewer people are willing to stop you. Intervention feels risky. Authority becomes fragmented. Advice turns cautious. No one wants to be the person who pushes too hard or says the wrong thing, so patterns continue. Public incidents started stacking instead of standing alone. Each one reinforced the next. Context disappeared, nuance evaporated, the conversation shifted from concern to judgment, and judgment rarely produces correction. It produces defensiveness. Defensiveness changes how people listen. Feedback starts to sound like attack. Guidance feels like control. Even genuine care becomes difficult to trust when it arrives through criticism. In that state, reflection feels unsafe. Another important factor during this period was identity confusion. When someone's sense of self has been shaped primarily through public response, losing approval feels like losing ground. The instinctive reaction is not calm reassessment, it's resistance. Pushing back becomes a way to assert existence. This resistance often gets mislabeled as ego. In reality, it's often fear. Fear of being erased, fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of facing who you are without the noise that once defined you. At the same time, the system around him began to shift posture. Tolerance thinned, patience wore out. Where there had once been protection, there were now boundaries. And boundaries, when introduced late, feel punitive rather than supportive. This is the moment where collapse accelerates. Not because behavior worsens overnight, but because the consequences finally align. Platforms withdraw, opportunities pause. The feedback loop changes from indulgence to enforcement. That shift is emotionally destabilizing. When the same world that once amplified you suddenly restricts you, it creates whiplash. The sense of betrayal can be overwhelming, even if the boundaries are justified. Without preparation, accountability feels like abandonment. In this phase, self-destructive patterns often intensify. Not out of recklessness, but out of confusion. When old coping mechanisms stop working and new ones haven't formed, instability fills the gap. The body looks for relief. The mind looks for escape. Public narratives rarely sit with this complexity. It's easier to point to a series of bad decisions than to examine the environment that normalized overload for years. Easier to individualize the failure than to question the system that produced the conditions. But collapse, in cases like this, is rarely about absence of talent or effort. It's about exhaustion without repair, pressure without processing, visibility without grounding. By this point, the distance between the person and the persona had grown extreme. The image people reacted to no longer matched the internal experience. That mismatch creates despair. It makes communication feel pointless. No matter what is said, it will be interpreted through a lens that feels fixed. Silence begins to look appealing. Withdrawal feels safer than explanation. But withdrawal, when sudden and unstructured, can deepen isolation instead of relieving it. This is where the conversation often turns toward redemption, even before repair has begun. The public looks for a turnaround narrative, a clean arc, a lesson learned. But real recovery does not follow narrative timelines. It requires slowing down in a culture that demands constant output. What was needed at this stage was not reinvention, but stabilization. Not rebranding, but rest. Not forgiveness, but space to rebuild internal structure away from constant evaluation. That kind of space is rare in modern fame, especially when the fall itself becomes content. Every pause gets analyzed. Every step back is interpreted as strategy or weakness. The person is never fully off stage. This is why recovery, when it eventually begins, often looks uneven. Progress is made privately while setbacks play out publicly. Growth happens quietly while mistakes are magnified. Understanding this phase matters because it reframes the collapse. It wasn't a single loss of control. It was the delayed cost of growing up under relentless attention, without consistent interruption or protection. And once that cost comes due, paying it requires more than apologies or explanations. It requires rebuilding identity separate from applause. That is not a fast process, and it cannot be rushed without breaking again. By the time the damage was fully visible, the most difficult work had already begun, and almost none of it was public. That's another part people misunderstand. Collapse looks loud from the outside, but recovery starts quietly. It begins away from cameras, away from commentary, away from the versions of yourself that other people recognize more easily than you do. What becomes clear at this stage is how deeply fame can interfere with self-trust. When your instincts have repeatedly led to public consequences, you start questioning your own judgment. Even simple decisions feel loaded. Every choice carries the fear of becoming another example, another headline, another lesson people argue over. This is where real vulnerability lives. Not in confession, but in uncertainty. For someone who spent years being told who they were, prodigy, problem, cautionary tale, the hardest task is separating identity from reputation. Reputation is loud, identity is quiet, and the quieter voice is easy to lose when you've lived inside constant feedback. Another shift happens here that rarely gets discussed. Accountability moves inward. Earlier, accountability arrived externally through criticism and consequences. Now it has to be internalized. That means taking responsibility without collapsing into shame. That balance is fragile. Shame tells you that you are the problem. Responsibility tells you that you have problems to work on. One isolates, the other stabilizes. The difference between the two often determines whether recovery is possible. During this period, progress is uneven. There are steps forward and steps back. Public patience is thin. Every misstep feels like confirmation that nothing has changed. But internal change does not follow a clean arc. It loops, it stalls, it repeats lessons. What makes this especially difficult is that growth requires privacy, while fame resists it. Even when someone steps back, the narrative follows. Silence gets interpreted, distance gets speculated about. Healing becomes something people wait to evaluate rather than allow to unfold. There is also grief in this phase. Grief for lost time, for versions of life that never had a chance to exist, for adolescence spent performing adulthood. That grief is rarely named, but it shapes everything that follows. At the same time, something stabilizing begins to form. Boundaries. Not dramatic ones, but practical ones. Slower pacing, fewer commitments, more intentional relationships, less need to be everywhere, all the time. This is where faith, structure, or routine often enters, not as image, but as scaffolding. Something predictable to return to when the external world feels chaotic. Stability doesn't come from passion in this phase. It comes from repetition. The public tends to interpret this stage through visible markers: marriage, lifestyle changes, public statements about growth. These moments matter, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is internal. Learning to sit with discomfort without escaping it, learning to feel emotion without broadcasting it, learning to exist without immediate validation. What's important is that this work doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. Experiences that once felt like pure failure begin to make sense as consequences of conditions, not character. That distinction allows self-compassion without denial. Still, the tension never disappears completely. Fame leaves residue. Certain pressures never fully dissolve. The difference is that they no longer dictate behavior. They're acknowledged, managed, and contained. This is the stage where the story becomes less dramatic but more meaningful. There are no shocking headlines, no clear victories, just gradual rebuilding, learning how to be present without being exposed, learning how to be seen without being consumed. Many people never get to this stage, not because they don't want to, but because the environment doesn't allow it. The fact that recovery remains possible at all speaks to how much effort goes unseen. This part of the story doesn't trend, it doesn't polarize, it doesn't offer easy conclusions, but it's the most honest chapter. Because survival after collapse isn't about returning to who you were. It's about becoming someone who can live with what happened, without being defined by it. And that kind of recovery doesn't announce itself. It simply continues, one quiet decision at a time. By the time stability begins to take shape, it doesn't feel like victory, it feels unfamiliar. After years of intensity, chaos, and constant reaction, calm can feel unsettling, silence can feel empty, and a life without constant noise can raise an unexpected question. Who am I when nothing is demanding something from me? This is the stage people rarely recognize because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. For Justin Bieber, survival after collapse was never going to look like a triumphant return or a perfectly scripted redemption arc. Those stories are neat. Real recovery isn't. It's uneven. It's quiet. And most of it happens in places the audience never sees. What becomes clear in this phase is that fame doesn't just leave scars on reputation. It leaves imprints on nervous systems. Years of hypervisibility train the body to stay alert, defensive, reactive. Even when the external pressure eases, the internal state doesn't reset automatically. Calm has to be learned. Safety has to be practiced. That's why the later chapters of this story feel slower, more contained, less performative. Not because the ambition disappeared, but because survival demanded a different pace. When someone has lived for years in a constant state of acceleration, slowing down isn't laziness, it's repair. Another important shift happens here. Validation loses its central role. Earlier, reaction, positive or negative, functioned as proof of existence. If people were talking, it meant you mattered. In recovery, that equation has to break. Worth has to detach from volume. Identity has to exist without applause. That's a difficult transition for anyone. It's even harder for someone whose adolescence and early adulthood were defined by attention at a global scale. Letting go of that feedback loop can feel like stepping into nothingness. But nothingness is where rebuilding begins. This is also where responsibility starts to feel different. Earlier, responsibility was imposed by contracts, schedules, expectations, and public judgment. Now it becomes chosen. Chosen boundaries, chosen priorities, chosen relationships. That distinction changes everything. Boundaries in particular become essential. Not dramatic walls, but quiet limits. Fewer appearances, fewer explanations, less engagement with narratives that thrive on speculation. These choices don't eliminate criticism, but they reduce its reach. They protect energy, which is the most valuable resource at this stage. What many people mistake for withdrawal is often recalibration. The body and mind learning how to exist without constant defense. The self learning how to be present without performing stability. There is also grief here. Grief for a childhood that never unfolded normally. Grief for mistakes made under conditions that were never fair. Grief for versions of self that existed only briefly before being consumed by expectation. This grief doesn't demand public acknowledgement, but it shapes maturity. Over time, something steadier emerges. Not perfection, not immunity, but awareness. Awareness of triggers, awareness of limits, awareness of how quickly momentum can turn into pressure if left unchecked. This awareness doesn't erase vulnerability, it reframes it. Vulnerability is no longer something that spills out under stress. It becomes something that is managed, protected, and shared selectively. That alone marks a fundamental shift from earlier patterns. Another misconception about this phase is that it's about becoming someone else. In reality, it's about integration, integrating talent with restraint, faith with self-trust, ambition with health, integrating the public self with the private one so they're no longer in constant conflict. That integration takes time. It also takes forgiveness, not from the public, but from the self. Without self-forgiveness, growth becomes punishment, and punishment does not heal. The public often watches this phase impatiently. People want certainty, proof that change is permanent, assurance that collapse won't repeat itself. But recovery doesn't offer guarantees. It offers intention, and intention has to be renewed continuously. That's why some days look strong and others look fragile. Why progress doesn't always move forward. Why silence sometimes returns. These aren't signs of failure. They're signs of a system learning how to regulate itself after years of overload. What matters is not whether the story ever becomes clean, but whether it becomes livable. This is where the broader lesson lives. Not just about Justin Bieber, but about fame itself. About what happens when success arrives before structure. When pressure outpaces protection, when talent is scaled faster than emotional capacity. The collapse wasn't caused by one decision, and the recovery isn't sustained by one realization. Both are products of systems. Systems that reward output more than health, visibility more than pacing, reaction more than reflection. If there's something unsettling about this story, it's because it forces us to question our role as observers. We consume the rise, we comment on the fall, we demand the comeback, but we rarely sit with the long middle, the slow, unglamorous work of staying alive and grounded after everything burns too hot, too fast. And maybe that's the most important part to notice, because if this story made you feel less entertained and more reflective, that's not an accident. It's an invitation to rethink how we talk about collapse, to reconsider what we reward, to ask whether we mistake resilience for silence and strength for endurance. If you found yourself thinking differently while listening about fame, pressure, or how early success shapes people, then this channel is meant for you. Share this with someone who understands that not every story needs a villain or a hero. Some stories are about survival inside systems that were never designed to be humane. And if you want more deep dives like this, stories that slow things down, look beneath behavior, and ask harder questions than headlines ever do, stay connected. Not because you're promised answers, but because you're willing to sit with complexity. Because the real story doesn't end when the noise fades. It begins when someone learns how to live without it.